Okay guys, tonight we step into a dimly lit chamber where rolled parchments whisper of lands lost to every atlas you've ever owned. And you probably won't survive this little reality check. Maps can be more dangerous than a GPS stuck in Siberia. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments, so we can see who's joining this midnight cartographic crawl. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a dust-choked floor, each footstep stirring up the echo of centuries as you approach a heavy oak table strewn with tattered fragments of what might be the very first maps ever drawn. Your fingers hover over brittle edges, and you can almost taste the iron tang of old ink in the air. Mainstream historians credit the Babylonian map of the world, etched into clay around 600 BCE, as one of the oldest surviving maps. But here these flecks of papyrus feel far older, as if dredged from a forgotten tomb. Historians still argue whether this was a local phenomenon or evidence of something far more widespread. As you slip on a pair of thin gloves, a tiny laugh escapes your lips. These gloves feel about as protective as a paper towel against the years of wear on these sheets. You brush away centuries of grime to reveal fine red and ochre lines, tracing coastlines you don't recognize, and you can't help but think that your phone's weather app couldn't even begin to handle this mystery. Fringe researchers whisper that some of these maps predate known seafaring civilizations, suggesting an advanced cartographic tradition we've all conveniently ignored. Some conspiracy buffs even claim these charts were gifted by sky visitors, but let's keep that between us. Your tinfoil hat is optional, but you might want it handy. The flicker of your lantern casts exaggerated shadows of geometric symbols dancing across the parchment. You notice a tiny, almost alien-looking circle marked with delicate strokes, an early meridian line perhaps, but drawn centuries before Ptolemy formalized the concept around 150 CE. Scholars still debate whether these lines were purely astronomical or encoded hidden religious significance. You trace the line with a sense of awe, imagining ancient astronomers bending their knees under the desert skies to align rods with the North Star crafting guides that mapped more than just terrain. A soft chuckle drifts from your lips as you recall the time your cousin tried navigating by the stars and ended up in his neighbor's koi pond instead of the local observatory, proof that stellar guidance can go hilariously off track. But these cartographers had precision. Some glyphs on these scraps indicate midday readings, accurate to within minutes, a feat that wouldn't be matched until medieval Islamic scholars refined astrolabe use in the 9th century CE. You lean closer, inhaling the faint scent of aged fibers and mysterious adhesives. Fringe lore mentions crocodile dung paste used by Egyptian scribes to bind papyrus. Whether true or not, you swear you detect something equally foul beneath the dust. You touch a corner where the map seems to depict a chain of mountains in perfect topographical detail, yet no modern mountain range fits the outline. Historians still argue whether this drawing represents a vanished landmass swallowed by changing coastlines or simply an artistic flourish gone rogue. Pulling back, you let your mind wander to the skilled hands that once held these very sheets. You imagine the cartographers hunched over a flickering oil lamp, lips pursed in concentration, whispering to themselves as they measured angles with primitive tools, probably wooden rulers and strings weighted with stones. You can almost hear the scratch of quill on papyrus and the muted curse when a smudge ruined an entire day's work. It's a human moment bridging millennia, as relatable as bungled DIY projects in your own living room. You ease into a nearby stool, careful not to collapse into a crystal display case, and gently place each fragment in order. A border of tiny circles catches your eye. Some claim these are star positions marking safe harbors, while others cry alchemy and insist the dots trace ley lines to tap Earth's mystic energy. Historians still argue whether belief in such energies drove early explorers or was later projection by hopeful occultists. You wiggle a finger at the skeptics. Sometimes mystery is more fun than certainty. A sudden breeze from a nearby grate rustles the parchments, sending brittle edges quivering like ancient moth wings. For a moment you half expect a phantom voice to hiss warnings of cursed kingdoms. Instead you crack a grin thinking that if these maps were haunted, they'd probably haunt your nightmares better than any horror flick. But there's genuine awe here. Each fine line, each faded annotation suggests a global network of knowledge sharing a blueprint of curiosity that spanned continents long before empires rose and fell. You record quick voice notes on your phone, thankfully still working, despite the seller's chill to capture the texture of this moment, because someday someone might want your sleepy ASMR ramblings on how you felt, discovering the roots of cartography. You whisper to yourself that if your only compass was your ex's mood swings, you'd still chart a truer path than most modern maps. 3 light jokes down, you settle into the realization that these shards are more than just weathered artwork. They are the first drafts of humanity's urge to understand space, not just the places. As your lantern gutter fades, you trace one final line that could represent a river system, now vanished beneath shifting sands or rising seas. You pause, aware that this single curve might rewrite a century of textbooks, or simply remain a delightful oddity stuffed in a museum basement. Whatever the truth this moment affirms, why you're here to breathe life into map fragments that once guided unknown voyagers and might still guide your imagination tonight. You lean over a low wooden lectern, the lantern's glow flickering over a sprawling proto-map that seems to whisper of a continent erased by time and tide. Mainstream sources often credit Ptolemy's Geographia circa 150 CE as the first text to hint at terra incognita beyond Europe, Asia and Africa. But here you're staring at lines that predate even his work by centuries. You probably won't survive this cartographic goose chase if you're prone to motion sickness. But hey, at least your snack will be safe on land. Fingers tracing a sweeping arc of chalky pigment, you note a landmass drawn west of known Africa, its shape vaguely heart-like. This isn't some medieval TO map tinkering, it's something more deliberate. Fringe scholars whisper of Lemuria, a hypothetical sunken continent that supposedly bridged India and Madagascar, but this parchment locates the vanished realm in the mid-Atlantic. You tuck that under your belt as a quirky tidbit to share at parties, though you wouldn't recommend diving into dinner conversation about submerged civilizations unless you fancy blank stares and awkward silences. The parchment's edges are scorched, as if someone once tried cremation, level destruction, and then chickened out. You smooth a crease to reveal coastal bays inked in greenish-brown hues, their curves too precise for random guesswork. Historians still argue whether these drawings reflect sailors' distorted memories or are deliberate fabrications meant to dazzle patrons with promises of untold riches. You smirk, imagining some ambitious cartographer pitching, "I can draw you Atlantis, sir, guaranteed," and the patron responding, "Perfect, where do I sign?" Your lantern sputters, urging you closer. Tiny sketches of odd flora decorate the borders, palm-like fronds next to conical flowers that look suspiciously like upside-down pineapples. Fringe enthusiasts insist these marginalia depict real plants brought back by lost expeditions, while skeptics laugh that it's just someone doodling their lunch. You recall that ancient crocodile dung paste rumor. It's almost as odorous as this map's faint mustiness, yet you swear you can't quite place the scent. You breathe in, shrugging off the possibility of actual dung. After all, your morning coffee smells worse. You trace a thin, jagged line inland where mountain peaks etched in grey meet river tributaries that snake toward an unseen sea. Modern geologists have theorized about the Azores Plateau as a potential remnant of lost land, but satellite imagery shows nothing but submerged volcanic rock. Historians still argue whether antiquities mariners ever glimpsed islands now long submerged, or if this is simply cartographic wishful thinking. You tap your lip picturing ancient sailors clinging to rafts crying land ho, only to discover it was just a patch of drifting seaweed. Joke 1 ticked off. A delicate compass rose its arrow pointing toward true north, sits improbably at the map's center, suggesting the maker knew of magnetic variation centuries before William Gilbert laid the groundwork in 1600. You tilt your head, wondering if this was mere coincidence, or if some cartographers had access to lost astrological treatises on Earth's magnetism. You crack a grin, thinking your fridge magnet from the 90s more accurately points the way to midnight snacks than these proto-compasses ever guided explorers. Joke 2 served cold. You spot annotations in a tight, elegant hand. Here lie skies of perpetual dawn, and beware the islands of living stone. You press your gloved fingertip to the words, wondering if it's a field note or a poetic flourish. Fringe theories propose that such phrases mark real regions of midnight sun near the Arctic transposed onto a forgotten continent through hearsay and exaggeration. Historians still argue whether these warnings were sincerely believed, survival tips, or savvy marketing to attract treasure hunters. You chuckle, recalling that time you tested a live volcano's heat by tossing in a marshmallow. Spoiler, it burned your eyebrows. The map's coloration is striking vivid ochre for deserts, deep teal for ocean, and streaks of crimson for highlands. You admire the artistry. This feels more like a grand mural than a mere navigational aid. Some say that pigments were extracted from ground gemstones, lending both luminosity and exorbitant expense. You can almost hear the cartographer haggling in an ancient bazaar. 1 ruby dust for my reds, please freshly pounded. You imagine your budget for coffee beans would barely cover the cost of 1 gem's pigment. Joke 3 freshly ground. Potential evidence of ghost cities appears as tiny black squares clustered along the northern coast. You study these symbols, recalling tales of Ogygia, Calypso's mythical isle, or Atlantis itself. While Plato's dialogues are the mainstream reference for lost continents, this map's alignment bears no resemblance to his narrative. Historians still argue whether Plato's tale was allegory or rooted in genuine memory of sunken lands. You tap a square, half expecting a pop-up window detailing tourist traps and overpriced souvenirs. Disappointment doesn't even begin to describe it. A sudden draft from an ancient stone archway sends a shiver down your spine. You wrap an arm around yourself, wishing you'd worn a warmer sweater beneath that flannel. As you catalogue the map's uncanny details, you feel an odd kinship with the anonymous cartographer, separated by millennia, yet united in wonder, curiosity, and questionable fashion choices. You picture them hunched over a slab of wood, whispering, "If only I could map the world, I'd have the best job ever," not unlike yourself muttering, "If only I could break 10,000 steps today, my Fitbit would be proud." Your phone's battery icon flashes red. Modern technology still fails you in the most dramatic moments, so you switch to writing mental notes. Vanished landmass west of known shores, ghost cities etched in ink, warnings of living stone. You promise yourself to research whether any oceanographer has ever found sonar anomalies hinting at sunken plateaus. Historians still argue whether sonar scannings qualify as archaeological methods, or if we're just pinging lost submarines. You picture an engineer scratching their head as a fish swims by, wondering why its echo return looks oddly map-like. You gently roll the proto-map back onto its wooden spindle, careful not to crush any fragile detail. As you stand, the room's stillness presses in, and you realize that some mysteries might remain unsolved, preserved only in these tantalizing fragments. You muster one last wry smile at the thought that your cousin who once got lost in a corn maze might fare better navigating this mythical continent. But for you, this map is not a dead end. It's an invitation to chase the horizon where legend and reality blur. You power down your lantern, letting darkness reclaim the chamber. You trace your steps back to the hatch, the echo of your boots on stone, a gentle reminder that the world above still waits. You may never find that vanished continent on modern charts, but tonight you've touched the edges of human imagination, and that's a map worth following. You slip out of the stone vestibule and into a narrow corridor lined with shelves of rolled parchings, each one's weathered ribbon beckoning like a siren's call. Among these silent sentinels, your gaze fixes on a series of maps, whose outer margins bristle with curious symbols, little cartouches and glyph-like doodads that look more like secret hieroglyphs than mere decorative flourishes. You probably won't survive your next trivia night if you blurt out, "Those are called cartouches," without explaining what they do. But hey, sleep-deprived cartographers are known for bold statements. Mainstream scholarship notes that medieval and Renaissance mapmakers often decorated borders with ornate cartouches, framed medallions containing titles, scales, or dedicatory inscriptions beginning around the 14th century as seen in the Catalan Atlas of 1375. Yet here these glyphs predate that atlas by centuries, implying an even earlier tradition of embedding encoded messages in border art. Historians still argue whether these proto-cartouches were purely ornamental or served a functional purpose like guiding expedition logistics or marking diplomatic gifts. Your fingers dance across the margins, tracing a repeating pattern of tiny spirals interspersed with three-pointed tridents and what might be miniature suns. One sketch resembles a stick-figure octopus wearing a crown, definitely not an official seal unless you count Octopi Kingdom as a long-forgotten polity. Fringe researchers love to speculate that these anthropomorphic symbols denote underwater kingdoms complete with mere creatures and coral palaces, but you know better than to let your afternoon tea get cold over sea monster gossip. Leaning close, you note faded annotations beside each symbol written in a loopy cursive that could be early Greek or some lost dialect altogether. One note reads, "Guardian of the hidden inlet," while another warns, "Heed the path of the three fires." You tap your lip, imagining a medieval version of your GPS cheerily chiding you in 200 meters bare, right at the lava flow. Joke one down, flame hazards fully acknowledged. The repetition of certain symbols suggests a codified system, perhaps akin to how modern maps use a blue line for rivers and green for forests. But these shapes are far more esoteric. You wonder if the three-pointed tridents mark shallow reefs that wrecked ancient galleys, or if they're arcane sigils meant to ward off bad omens. Historians still argue whether these border glyphs represent real-world hazards or allegorical warnings layered with religious undertones. A sudden drip from the arched ceiling makes you startle your glove slipping on a slick stone. You almost curse in second person. Don't drop that precious scroll, genius, but you catch yourself remembering the PG-13 rule. You dab the moisture away, muttering that the only thing wetter than these walls is your sense of adventure. But the slip gives you a closer look. Micro-scratches around one spiral hint at repeated handling, as if countless hands over generations reached to touch that very symbol. Perhaps it marked a revered shrine or sacred harbor, drawing pilgrims as much as traders. You settle onto a low bench, unfolding the map so the border symbols arc around you like an ancient laurel wreath. Candle sconces along the walls send dancing shadows across the ink, turning the spirals into miniature whirlpools and the suns into staring eyes. It's all very secret society meets National Geographic, and you're here for it. Quirky tidbit: some believe that these staring eyes motifs are the earliest known searchlights warning sailors that watchful deities guard forbidden shores. Use at your own risk, angelic light shows not included. Your mind drifts back to that vanished continent you studied just moments ago, imagining its coastlines peppered with these glyphs, like breadcrumbs left by a cosmic Hansel and Gretel. You picture lost travelers, map in hand, squinting at a three-ringed spiral and deciding, well, best not paddle there. Sounds dangerous. But is it danger or invitation? Historians still argue whether these symbols functioned as prohibitions or secret endorsements meant only for the initiated. A tap on your shoulder, well, a phantom tap more like an echo makes you jump. You blink, chastising yourself that you're not in a haunted house tour, just a hallowed archive. You chuckle softly, recalling that time you bought a ghost detector app that just beeped whenever your phone overheated. Joke two modern tech parallels in archaic libraries. Returning to the map, you notice that the cartouche shapes change every few inches. Spirals give way to diamond loops, then to interlocking rings. One startling emblem resembles a simplified labyrinth, its entrance marked by a tiny dot. Fringe lore insists this marks the lair of a map-obsessed cult, but scholars caution against reading occult sects into every irregularity. Historians still argue whether such labyrinthine symbols encoded real hidden pathways or were merely fanciful illustrations meant to impress patrons. You scratch your head wondering if your next YouTube thumbnail should feature an arrow pointing at the labyrinth and the word OMG. The coloration of these glyphs is also intriguing: ochre vermilion, and occasional smudges of metallic silver that catch your lamplight like tiny pinpricks of starlight. You prod a fleck of silver, curious if it's actual metal or some glittery byproduct of pigment mishandling. Quirky tidbit: pigment scholars sometimes find ground-up shark teeth in medieval paints, lending them a subtle luminescence. Don't ask how they discovered that, just trust that map-making was never a tidy art. You lean back, propping the map across your knees. Your phone vibrates with a notification, probably a reminder to hydrate courtesy of your fitness tracker. You sigh, imagining a medieval scribe ranting, "If only I had an app to remind me to drink camel milk between charting." Joke 3 brought to you by Camel Nature's original portable computing device. As you study the repeating patterns, you realize they resemble a primitive coordinate grid, though nobody in antiquity formalized latitude and longitude until Ptolemy. Could these border cartouches be proto-graticules, marking degrees in an early geographic system? Historians still argue whether Ptolemy's work built entirely new frameworks or formalized centuries of folk geology and seafaring lore. You imagine your cousin's attempt at coordinate geometry, likely scribbles better thrown away than saved to posterity. You gently lift the map's corner and slide a blank slip of parchment underneath, intending to trace one of the more enigmatic symbols later. You plan to compare it with symbols on other fragments, seeking repetition that might unlock the code. Scholars might scoff at DIY paleography, but hey, everyone starts somewhere. Just don't tell them you traced it using a ballpoint pen. Future archaeologists may puzzle over ink blotches and wonder if they were part of the deception. Before stowing the map back on its shelf, you pause to commit one final observation to memory. The cartouches seem to cluster around areas depicted as harbors or river deltas, suggesting they might have denoted safe anchorages or checkpoints where ships could resupply. Whether they marked customs posts or cultic rites, nobody knows for sure. Historians still argue whether such symbols evolved into modern buoys and lighthouses, or if we've simply romanticized mariners' tales. You secure the scroll with a ribbon, whispering a silent promise to return. The corridor stretches before you, silent except for the soft tick of your heartbeat. As you step away, you can't help but smile. These peculiar border symbols are more than mere decorations. They are the voice of cartographers long vanished, attempting to speak across millennia. And you, wide-eyed and whispering into the dark, are here to listen. You step into a cool alcove where a single desk lamp casts a soft halo over a sprawling parchment covered in sinuous lines, that twist like restless snakes, ancient river networks drawn with unnerving precision. You probably won't survive the thrill of discovering waterways that defy every modern atlas, but hey, your houseplants will appreciate the humidity from your excitement. As you lean in, your fingertips hover centimeters above the ink, and you swear you can hear the distant rush of water echoing through the archive's stone walls. Mainstream scholars note that the 2nd century Geographia by Ptolemy catalogued major rivers like the Nile and the Danube with remarkable detail for its time. Yet these diagrams predate his treatise by centuries. Here tributaries branch and rebranch into bewildering mazes, some streaming toward coastlines that no longer exist. Historians still argue whether these were based on first-hand surveys by seafaring explorers or derived from traveler hearsay amplified into cartographic legend. You trace a broad teak-colored artery labeled in faded ink, its name ending in as reminiscent of Sanskrit river names like Saraswati, once thought mythical until satellite imagery hinted at buried channels in India's Thar Desert. Fringe enthusiasts pounce on this, claiming the map records a motherlode of lost rivers that nourished forgotten civilizations. You smirk, imagining a Reddit thread titled Proof of Hidden Harappan Waterways, while your coffee cools faster than those purported streams dried up. A gentle hiss escapes as your lamp flickers, urging you closer. You notice each riverline is composed of thousands of tiny dashes, as if the cartographer meticulously painted every current ripple by hand. Quirky tidbit pigment analysis occasionally uncovers ground snail shell mixed into river blue paint to achieve a subtle iridescence. Ancient cartographers were basically the original influencers of texture. You wonder if your watercolor set has that level of flair. Last time you tried it looked like your toddler's art project. Joke one down. The map's central feature is a network of interconnected lakes, with rivers radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. You imagine a giant watery hub at the map's heart, perhaps a mystical inland sea that supplied fresh water to caravans and curious pilgrims. Scholars still argue whether this central nexus ever existed, or if it's a symbolic super river representing the unity of all lands. You stifle a chuckle, thinking your local roundabout is far less navigable, yet you never see maps glorifying it. Your breathing slows as you run a gloved hand along one tributary that splits into 3 near a mountain sketch. One branch heads north into a region marked by swirling dunes. Another veers east toward a dotted line of small islands. The last disappears into a shaded blank space, perhaps a deliberate void for unknown territory. Fringe theory suggests that missing branch was the Incas' lost Vilcabamba River, swallowed by landslides and secrecy. You raise an eyebrow picturing Incan pottery submerged in a muddy tomb, with archaeologists crying, "We knew it all along. Spoiler alert, they probably didn't." You lean back your shoulder, brushing against a dusty shelf stacked with leather-bound journals. The slight creak is almost melodic, as if the room itself is adding a soundtrack. You recall that in medieval China, mapmakers during the Song dynasty 960–1279 CE documented river courses with bamboo brushes noting seasonal floods. In contrast, this map's depictions seem to encode not just geography, but hydrological cycles, tiny crescent moons, beside certain channels indicating flood months. Historians still argue whether these lunar annotations guided planting calendars or served ritual purposes. Either way, they beat your phone's weather app, which still can't predict tomorrow's rain. A faint scent of must and aged leather drifts through the air. You close your eyes briefly to savor it, imagining yourself navigating these rivers in a dugout canoe carved from a single tree trunk. No GPS, no motor, just raw adventure. You open one eye to catch a tiny sketch of a canoe with a stick figure paddler casually waving. Fringe lore insists this doodle marks an early travelogue, but skeptics call it the cartographer's personal signature. You grin thinking you'd sign your maps with a smiley face, if only emoji keyboards existed then. Joke 2 firmly in place. Focusing again, you notice clusters of short parallel lines perpendicular to the rivers. Those are barbed symbols indicating rapids or waterfalls remarkably similar to modern topographic conventions. Mainstream cartographic history credits early modern mapmakers for such symbols, but this sheet suggests their origin might be far older. Historians still argue whether these markers were practical guides for boatmen or metaphorical warnings about life's unpredictability. You tap your glove against the desk, musing that navigating life's rapids sometimes feels like paddling upstream with a toothpick. Your finger drifts to a river delta that fans into countless channels before meeting the ocean's edge. Tiny dots mark what could be fishing villages or market towns, too systematic to be random doodles. Quirky tidbit rumor has it that medieval fishermen paid tribute in preserved fish oil to cartographers, so their villages would appear on maps talk about paying to play. You imagine pitching that deal to your landlord. I'll throw in some ramen packets if you bump me up on the neighborhood glow meter. Joke 3 delivered with seasoning. You note a series of subtle annotations adjacent to certain rivers, small crosses inside circles like plus signs hugging Earth's veins. Some believe these signify holy waters used in purification ceremonies, while others think they mark medicinal springs. Historians still argue whether these symbols originated in temple rituals or were later additions by clerical map custodians. You tilt your head picturing monks diligently charting spring water purity levels, temperature lukewarm, spiritual clarity questionable. The lamp's glow flickers again, casting dancing shadows that warp the river patterns into living creatures, but you blink and they snap back to serene waterways. You rest a hand on your chest, feeling your heart echo in time with the map's sinuous loops. Part of you aches to load these sheets onto a drone scanner for LiDAR analysis. Modern tech meets ancient art, but you hold back, resisting the urge to spoil the mystery with high-tech wizardry. As you prepare to roll up the parchment, your eyes catch a tiny marginal note. Follow the water's whisper. You lean in so close your eyelashes brush the paper, imagining the cartographer leaning in on the opposite side, whispering secrets you're only beginning to hear. Historians still argue whether such poetic directives served as navigational mnemonics or spiritual counsel to heed nature's signals. You tuck the map away gently, promising yourself to return with fresh coffee and open eyes. You step out of the alcove, a trace of river blue pigment on your glove, a silent souvenir of your journey. You pause in the hallway's gloom and flex your fingers, watching the pigment swirl like a miniature river delta in the lamplight. You grin, whispering, tonight you've paddled along currents no modern explorer has charted, and you feel that familiar thrill of discovery mingled with sleep's beckoning pull. You unfold a slender vellum scroll marked with an array of straight, unbroken lines stretching from the top to the bottom of the map. You probably won't survive an afternoon staring at bed charts like this, but at least your nightstand won't need new batteries. These vertical marks suggest meridian lines, longitudinal guides, drawn long before ships measured time zones. Historians still argue whether these lines were purely astronomical references, or if they encoded secret pilgrimage routes stretching across continents. Mainstream cartography credits Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE with calculating Earth's circumference by measuring the sun's angle along a single meridian between Syene and Alexandria, an ingenious use of geography and astronomy. Yet this scroll seems to predate his opus, hinting that earlier scholars mapped true north and south lines with remarkable precision. You lean closer, tracing each inked mark, and you wonder how many naked feet trod these paths before your yoga mat existed. You pause as a subtle grid of perpendicular ticks intersects the meridians, forming what looks like a rudimentary longitude-latitude network. Fringe theorists gleefully point out that some ticks align with star positions in ancient Egyptian charts, suggesting a celestial template beneath the ink, like overlaying technoweb imagery on the Rosetta Stone. Whether these are genuine observational markers or fanciful afterthoughts, historians still argue whether ancient mapmakers truly understood spherical geometry or simply sketched what felt right. You swallow, reminded of your GPS app that blurts out, recalculating at the slightest detour. Primitive minds didn't have autopilot, but they sure dreamed big. A quick shimmy of your lantern reveals a faded inscription along one meridian line of eternal dawn. You lean so close, the lamp's heat kisses your cheek, and you hope it's not crocodile dung paste. Reactivated one smell test, and you're definitely not an ancient Egyptian scribe. Fringe enthusiasts propose this refers to locations where the sun never sets during solstice rituals. Others dismiss it as poetic license. Historians still argue whether such phrases signified practical timekeeping aids or mystical cosmological doctrines passed among priest astronomers. You tilt the scroll upright and spot a small diagram of a sundial perched at the meridian's midpoint. Mainstream academia credits Greek engineer Andronicus of Syrtis with the sundial innovations in the 1st century BCE, but this doodle seems unnervingly older. You chuckle that your smartwatch flashlight can't even replicate a sundial's vibe. Skeptics caution that early sundials were mostly political prestige projects rather than cartographic tools. Yet historians still argue whether these markings aided real timekeeping or were status symbols for ruling elites. Your stomach rumbles as you notice a faint sketch of an hourglass beside one of the meridian ticks. You probably won't survive long without dinner after this mental cartography marathon, but at least this map has no low battery warnings. Fringe theory suggests early mapmakers used sandflow gauges to measure travel time between latitudes, basically ancient mile markers with mood lighting. Historians still argue whether hourglasses were practical survey tools or later romanticized inventions. You tap your chin, imagining a surveyor balancing sand while riding a donkey. A small cluster of symbols toward the bottom of the scroll catches your eye, tiny scales, with weights on either side drawn along the meridian. Mainstream accounts record that 16th century cartographers used the principle of equilibrium in map projection theories, but this map suggests early conceptual hints of balancing spatial distortion. Fringe commentators insist this marks a lost science of geographic fairness, leveling kingdoms for equitable trade. Historians still argue whether these scales were literal licensing stamps or metaphorical reminders of nature's balance. You break for a moment and sip from your water bottle. Hydration is key, even in catacomb libraries. The map's meridian lines seem to converge at 2 points, one etched near a mountain sketch, the other beside a tiny sunburst. Fringe lore says these convergence points mark portal-like coordinates to underground worlds. Historians still argue whether such nodes represent actual survey stations used by ancient geographers or visionary maps hinting at subterranean realms. You shake your head, glad your ceiling doesn't have hidden tunnels. You fold the scroll gently and slide it back into its leather tube, but not before noticing a faint set of coordinates scribbled in the margin, numbers separated by dots eerily reminiscent of modern decimal degrees. You probably won't survive a crash course in coordinate conversion, but at least your phone can do the math. Fringe conspiracists see these as proofs of ancient GPS prototypes, while mainstream historians dismiss them as later additions by map librarians. Historians still argue whether such marginalia are authentic or scribe-era graffiti. You slip into a nearby reading nook, seating yourself in a creaking chair that moans like it knows the weight of every scholar who ever sat there. The walls are lined with globe replicas, though none match your newfound vertical lines, just dusty spheres of plaster and faded paint. You recall the cousin who bought a novelty globe that spun backward because it's fun, and you chuckle that at least he wasn't misreading meridians. As your eyelids grow heavier, you linger on one globe with a painted prime meridian bisecting Europe, ironically, chosen centuries before Greenwich earned official status in 1884. Historians still argue whether cartographers favored local meridians like Paris's or Mecca's to assert cultural dominance. The thought that lines on paper became lines of power strikes you as elegantly simple and oddly human. You rub your eyes, promising a stronger coffee tomorrow just to recalibrate your sense of north. As you step away from the scroll, your lamp dims to a whisper and your eyelids flutter with sleep's promise. You stagger toward the archive's exit, humming a tune about meridian lines, being better at dividing world time than your ex's mood swings ever could. You feel that familiar tug to grin at the absurdity and hush yourself bedtime history wouldn't be complete without a wink at the past. You promise to chase these meridian mysteries in your dreams, and maybe Google decimal degree conversion tomorrow if your brain hasn't melted from all the lines. You slip into a vaulted chamber where faint drafts carry a scent of brine, and shards of coastal sketches lie scattered like driftwood across a low table. You probably won't survive the sensory overload if you're prone to seasickness, but at least your sea-legged cousin, remember him, would nod approvingly. You lean in so close that the cool stone walls behind you feel like a ship's hull, and every breath tastes like a storm-tossed wave on your tongue. Before you, broken coastline outlines coil across multiple parchments, each fragment hinting at bays and inlets that vanish into torn edges or smudged ink. Mainstream historians credit the 1st century geographer Strabo with mapping the Mediterranean's shores with impressive detail, but these sketches suggest coastlines drawn centuries before him, perhaps reflecting shorelines erased by rising sea levels after the last ice age. Historians still argue whether these variations record real prehistoric coasts or are simply cartographic approximations woven from travelers' stories. Your gloved fingertips hover over a jagged promontory outlined in faded silver pigment. Legend has it that ancient mapmakers ground mother of pearl into their inks to capture the glint of surf under dawn light. Quirky tidbit: some pigment analysts swear they have found flecks of pulverized seashells in these outlines, suggesting the coastlines literally shimmered on the page. You can't help but smile at the thought of medieval scribes mixing oyster shells into ink like DIY home decorators. A closer look reveals tiny perfectly spaced dots along what appears to be a gulf. These are likely markers for coastal cities or safe harbors. Some fringe enthusiasts insist these dots encode secret trade routes for exotic spices and rare stones, implying a clandestine network predating the Silk Road's heyday. You can almost hear merchants whispering, "Shh, not so loud, red coral costs extra." Historians still argue whether these markers warned of pirate-infested coves or celebrated trading posts where amber flowed like currency. The parchment's ragged edges expose layers of older sketches beneath newer outlines, as if successive generations erased and redrew the same coastline again and again. You press a fragment's corner between thumb and forefinger, feeling its brittle texture like the dried rind of a salt-fished fish. You compare it to today's satellite photos on your phone, fortunately still loaded with maps, only to watch your GPS recalculating in real time as if mocking the ancients for lacking 5G. Joke one, at least they wouldn't lose signal halfway through a voyage. A scrap shows a bay drawn with meticulous scalloped curves, each wave cresting into a tiny ampersand symbol. Riddle fans suggest this denotes and beyond signaling explorers to push past known seas. Skeptics snort that it's merely a decorative flourish, yet historians still argue whether such symbols served as actual directives for mariners or were ornamental last-minute doodles by bored scribes. You chuckle, imagining an ancient cartographer stuck in a midnight oil session, drawing little and shapes instead of goose feet. You lay several fragments side by side, attempting to piece together a continuous coastline. One strip with a series of L-shaped bays clicks into place, with another showing a series of jagged coves. The join feels eerily precise, as if the two pieces were torn apart in a hurry. Fringe lore whispers that rival kingdoms once ripped maps from each other's archives to hide secret passages, cartographic warfare, if you will. You raise an eyebrow, picturing medieval scribes dueling with quills. On guard, your coast is mine. Joke 2, tamp down the dramatics. This is bedtime history. Your eyes drift to a slender parchment whose coast is traced in red ochre that bleeds into the surrounding parchment like spilled wine on a banquet cloth. You tilt it toward the lamp's glow and gasp. The outline matches no modern shoreline, but it could represent an estuary swallowed by shifting sands or volcanic eruptions. Geologists have theorized about sunken river deltas off the coast of the Black Sea, and tantalizingly sonar scans have revealed underwater cliffs where none should exist. Historians still argue whether such submerged topography inspired mythic flood tales like Noah's Ark, or if that's just seaside storytelling gone wild. A narrow strip depicts clusters of small circles perched on peninsulas, likely fortress towns, commanding narrow straits. You trace one circle and wince, picturing early engineers hauling massive stones uphill to build walls. Mainstream archaeology documents numerous Bronze Age coastal fortifications along the Levant, yet these circles appear in unexpected locations, like the shores of a phantom island that no modern map acknowledges. You tap the paper, wondering if Atlantean refugees once fortified their hidden kingdoms here. Quirky tidbit: a local legend in Brittany speaks of an island of Saint Sunken that appears only on full moons, cartographic coincidence or shared memory. Historians still argue whether such lore reflects collective misremembering of tides or genuine glimpses of vanished lands. You shift the lamp to reveal faint parallel lines inland converging on a point labeled with a tiny starburst. Could this denote a river mouth leading to an inland caravan route? You recall the river networks from Section 4, intertwining with these coastal fragments, hinting at a global system of waterborne trade. You sigh, thinking your commute on overcrowded subways pales in comparison to hauling spices by dugout canoe across unknown coasts. Joke 3, at least the MTR has air conditioning. Flicking to another piece, you find what looks like a rough sketch of a lighthouse perched on a cliff. Mainstream sources credit the lighthouse of Alexandria, built around 280 BCE, as one of the ancient wonders guiding ships safely to harbor. Yet this depiction seems less ornate and more utilitarian, as if early mariners improvised beacons of fire on cliffs long before Pharos' grandeur. Historians still argue whether such rudimentary lights were widespread, or if only a handful of major ports lit the way. You imagine your phone's flashlight feature failing you on a midnight stroll. Ancient beacon builders had a tougher job and maybe better fire insurance. You gather the fragments and assemble them loosely on a large drafting table that creaks under their weight. The combined image forms a jagged coastline that could border anywhere from southeasterly Asia to Atlantis' rumored periphery, depending on how you rotate it. You reach for a digital sketchpad, thankfully inventing the phrase analog-digital fusion isn't on tonight's agenda, yet you resist the urge to overlay GPS coordinates. After all, some mysteries feel best preserved in analog. A gentle ripple of air from a slightly ajar window chills your skin, reminding you of the ocean breeze. You breathe deeply, savoring the tang of salt and ink, and you imagine waves lapping at those shaded shores. Historians still argue whether these coastal outlines encode a large-scale maritime chart used by an early seafaring empire, or if they are simply local sketches collected over centuries by curious antiquarians. You let the question hang as you gently roll each fragment. Fragments of coastlines, fragments of memory, into a small leather satchel. Your glove picks up a smudge of ochre, which you next wipe on your notebook by habit. You pause, realizing you've almost claimed the map's pigment for your own childish gallery. You chuckle softly, recalling the pigment-dusted fingers in section 1, and wonder if you've become as curious as those early cartographers, just with better lighting and fewer scorpions underfoot. You zip the satchel and stand stretching limbs that have hunched over the table for too long. As sleep tugs at your eyelids, you step away from the drafting table, leaving the coastal puzzles behind. You feel the familiar thrill of uncovering civilization's hidden edges, and you promise yourself to return with fresh eyes, plus a sturdy spreadsheet to log each dot and line. You lean against the door jamb, closing your eyes briefly, and imagining those coastlines unfolding in your dreams, where every bay might whisper the location of a forgotten city. You descend into a narrower corridor now, where the walls are lined not with shelves, but with vertical scroll racks, each holding maps that seem more mythical than practical. These are the Forbidden Island illustrations. You probably won't survive this portion if you're the type who gets lost in open-world video games, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than a pirate's treasure vault. As you slide a scroll free, you brace yourself for dragons, sea serpents, or worse. Early explorers' wild imaginations left unchecked. You unroll the parchment slowly, careful not to let the brittle edges crack. Before you sprawls a group of islands drawn in almost ornamental detail, scattered like puzzle pieces across an ocean that doesn't match any known hemisphere. Mainstream cartographers have long dismissed such illustrations as artistic flourishes, wishful thinking by mapmakers who needed to fill space or sell the allure of discovery. But these particular islands appear across multiple documents in this archive, and they match in shape, placement, and strange symbology. Historians still argue whether these recurring islands, some with crescent beaches, others spiked with volcanoes, are deliberate copies of each other, or echoes of a real archipelago lost to time. Some French researchers call them the Shadow Isles. Others go further, claiming these maps were erased from official history, hidden after expeditions to these islands resulted in disappearances, mutinies, or worse. You cock your head amused. Your biggest island emergency was getting sand in your earbuds. Joke 1, mildly itchy, still true. Your eyes lock on a particular island shaped like a teardrop, with an eerie spiral drawn into its center. Alongside it, in jagged ink, a single word, Vercados. You whisper it aloud, and it sounds like the kind of place your GPS would refuse to pronounce. You follow the spiral inward with your finger, and notice something odd. Each concentric ring is made of tiny hash marks like teeth. Fringe interpretations suggest this is a depiction of an island built atop a sunken structure, possibly the remnants of a volcano or even a stepped pyramid. Mainstream historians scoff, arguing these are simply artistic embellishments. But still, that spiral draws you in. Next to Vercados is a cluster of 3 islands arranged in a triangle. One is labeled Nithria, another Eos Morn, and the last is simply marked with an eye symbol. No name, just an eye. You lean in. The eye is drawn with such precision it almost glints under your lamplight. Creepy, yes. Fascinating, also yes. You remember the old sailor superstition's eyes, painted on boats to see through fog and spirits. Historians still argue whether these icons are warnings, claims of ownership, or representations of divine guardians. You smirk and whisper, "Don't blink," as if the island's staring back. Joke 2, Doctor Who fans unite. You flip to another scroll, this one darker, the parchment tinted greyish blue, as if it had been soaked in ink water. A massive circular island dominates the center, surrounded by smaller islets that seem to orbit it like moons. Strange dotted lines connect them like ley lines or magnetic fields. You trace them lightly, wondering if this is an ancient compass or some esoteric code. Fringe theorists believe these dots are star maps encoded within island formations, implying knowledge of astral geography far beyond their era. Historians still argue whether such interpretations hold water, no pun intended, or are simply the fever dreams of cryptographers who spent too long in candlelight. Quirky tidbit: one of these island scrolls has a smudge that's shaped like a paw print. Scholars once thought it was accidental until they found similar prints in maps stored hundreds of miles away. Some believe it was the mark of a mapmaker's loyal animal companion, perhaps a monkey or even a small jungle cat used as a signature. You can't help but imagine a tired, barefoot scribe reaching down to scratch his furry assistant under the chin before rolling the ink-stamped scroll back up. You hope that monkey got a raise. You unroll a narrower scroll, and this time the islands are labeled with riddles. One says, "Where the sun touches bone beware." Another, "3 stones guard the whispering gate." And finally your favorite, "Come with sail, leave with silence." Historians still argue whether these were simply poetic metaphors meant to scare away treasure hunters or actual warnings handed down from mariners who witnessed something. You whisper the riddles aloud and feel the hair on your arms rise. You've read enough to know that sometimes metaphor and memory blur. Your lantern catches a gold-inked sketch of an island with angular ridges, almost architectural in shape. It resembles a gear, each tooth housing what looks like a tiny structure or watchtower. Fringe theorists speculate this was a mechanical island, an ancient floating fortress, if you can believe it. You raise an eyebrow, amused but intrigued. Joke 3, if it runs on gears, it probably breaks down right after the warranty ends. You take a moment to survey the bigger picture. Across all these forbidden island maps, a pattern begins to emerge. Circular landforms, recurring triangular placements, strange spirals, and always some cryptic symbol nearby, a star, an eye, a claw, or even a cross made of thorns. You begin sketching them onto a spare sheet, trying to align them like constellations. Are they meant to match the stars? Are the islands themselves a mirror of the heavens? Historians still argue whether this kind of symbolic geography was based on ritual or coincidence, or if it's all modern projection. A scroll near the end is unlike the others. It's mostly blank, save for one massive X over a featureless C. The ink used is oddly thick, slightly raised, almost like wax. You touch it. It's rough. Dried blood, some once suggested. Nonsense, says every serious scholar. But then again, who labels nothing with such emphasis? What's beneath the X? You pause, shiver slightly, and re-roll the map with more care than usual. You finish organizing the scrolls, each one tied and nested in its slot, like secrets hidden in plain sight. You take a final glance at the one labeled Eos Morn, its crescent shape curling toward the edge of the parchment. It seems almost to move under the lantern's light, as if waiting to be rediscovered. You breathe out slowly, steady and deep. Tonight you've touched the edges of imagination. Islands that might not exist yet still live alive in ink, in riddle, in wonder. As you turn to leave the room, you mutter softly, "Maybe some places aren't lost. Maybe we just stopped looking." You step into a chamber noticeably quieter than the rest, as if even the air has agreed to hush. Here you find maps unlike any you've seen, thin, tall scrolls with blank spaces dominated by spindly writing and cryptic doodles in the margins. These are the cryptic marginal inscriptions. You probably won't survive this one if your brain short-circuits at messy handwriting, but don't worry, we're going full detective mode now, minus the trench coat and magnifying glass. You unfurl a scroll, slowly revealing a wide expanse of tan parchment that looks almost empty until you peer closer. Along the edges there are tiny notations scrawled in a looping, tangled script that resembles cursive Greek caught in a hurricane. Mainstream scholars often dismiss such marginalia as scribes, personal reminders, ink recipes, prayer verses, or even shopping lists. But these notes are different. They repeat across unrelated maps. Same loops, same phrasing, same odd symbols and hourglass, a broken circle and a curled line like a falling leaf. Historians still argue whether these recurring inscriptions are part of a lost written language or simply a cipher used by a close guild of ancient cartographers. Fringe theorists go wild with this idea, of course. They say these maps were passed in secret, annotated only by members of a map cult sworn to protect the knowledge of a forgotten world. You imagine these ancient scholars wearing cloaks and muttering riddles in underground chambers, while in reality they probably spilled wine and argued about ink smudges. Joke 1: mysticism meets office gossip. One phrase catches your eye: the sun does not rise here, only memory. You say it aloud and shiver. The words are written near the depiction of a jagged cliff with no landmass attached, just hanging there in the corner of the page, as if the cliff itself was a thought, not a place. You trace the text with your fingertip, marveling at the fine lines. Ink like that was likely made from oak galls and iron salts, notorious for both permanence and slowly burning through to parchment over centuries. Quirky tidbit: some old inks are known to ghost, seeping through to the other side and leaving mirror images that scholars mistake for coded symbols. You flip the parchment to the back, and there it is. The same phrase mirrored and glowing faintly in your lantern's flicker. Not just ghosting, deliberate, dual-layer writing. Historians still argue whether these mirrored texts were ritualistic, practical, or just the byproduct of poor materials. You chuckle, thinking of the time you accidentally printed your tax return double-sided. Joke 2: bureaucracy meets the Byzantine. Moving along the scroll's margin, you find a cluster of geometric shapes, triangles interlaced with half-circles overlapping in a way that resembles mountain ranges, solar eclipses, or maybe even constellation diagrams. One has a tiny number scrawled next to it, 27. You quickly check 3 other maps, same number, same corner, same shapes. Now it's getting weird. Fringe theorists claim 27 was a code for a star only visible in the southern hemisphere during ancient solstices. Mainstream historians, they sigh. They say it's probably a cataloging number like file drawer 27B. Still, the repetition nags at you. You sketch it in your notebook, circling the number, just in case you wake up at 3 a.m. with an epiphany. Beside the shapes is another phrase: do not cross the wind line. What does that mean? Is it weather or metaphor? You think back to Section 5's meridian lines and wonder if there was a wind line, just as sacred a threshold between knowledge and madness. Historians still argue whether such cryptic warnings were navigational cues or spiritual boundaries carved into paper. Another scroll, shorter and wider, has no map at all, just margins full of looping text and strange little symbols. A skull with vines growing from it, a circle wrapped in fire, a triangle balanced on a feather. You raise an eyebrow. This feels less like a map and more like prophecy, or poetry, or both. One fringe interpretation suggests that these symbols are mnemonic devices, pictographs, to help a map reader recall oral history. You whisper the phrase beneath one symbol. He who walks the second shore finds only echoes. You chuckle softly. Joke 3 sounds like every beach vacation when it rains for 5 days straight. The most striking scroll is one with a faint grid pattern barely visible beneath the margin. Notes suggesting that the inscriptions came after the map itself, added by a second or third generation of map keepers. One line reads, "The third mouth opens when no stars are above." Is that a time, a place? A riddle historians still argue whether phrases like this signal lunar eclipses, ocean tides, or metaphorical gates to inner wisdom. You write it down anyway because someday, when you're standing somewhere you shouldn't be, it might mean something. You find a rare Latin phrase among all the strange glyphs non locus sed memoria, not a place but a memory. It's scrawled next to an empty box that might have once contained an island, a village, a name. Whatever it was, it's been scraped away. You wonder if these maps were censored, edited over time, like forgotten truths, redacted for safety or silence. Fringe writers believe secret societies removed dangerous knowledge from maps after certain explorers didn't return. You don't know what to believe, but you admit your heart beats faster reading it. Before leaving the chamber, you organize the scrolls by their inscriptions. The repetition forms a rhythm, a chant in paper, a litany of lost wisdom. The second mouth, the third line, the wind returns. Are they instructions, warnings, a bedtime lullaby for an extinct civilization? You roll up the final scroll and slip it into a case marked with nothing but a crescent and a feather. You pause, exhaling slowly. These marginal notes aren't filler. They are the echo left behind by people who once looked at maps the same way you do, not just as guides to places but to meaning, to memory, to myth. As you close the door behind you, you whisper one last line into the dark. Do not cross the wind line, just in case. You arrive in a cluttered chamber that smells of charred wood and ink, where worn-out brushes and fractured calipers lie scattered across cracked stone shelves. This room is different. No maps, just the bones of how they were made. You probably won't survive this one if you thought Google Earth was the peak of map technology, but tonight you're stepping into the chaotic genius of ancient cartographic tools and techniques. A splintered compass, its wooden casing etched with the concentric rings, sits atop a faded cloth. You pick it up carefully. No needle inside, but a thin groove at the center suggests it once housed a lodestone, a naturally magnetized rock used long before polished compasses made their debut in China during the Han dynasty around the 2nd century BCE. Mainstream scholars accept that such magnetic tools were used for orientation, but here the designs look pre-Chinese. Historians still argue whether the earliest compasses were spiritual instruments before they became navigational ones. Leaning over the adjacent table, you spot a series of triangular frames, like jagged pizza slices, with string strung between their sides. Early astrolabes. Numbered. These are more primitive, possibly groma tools used by Roman surveyors to align roads and borders. But this version has teeth carved along the base as if to mark distance. Fringe theorists insist this was a proto-scale device, suggesting even Bronze Age mapmakers could measure and plot with startling accuracy. You grin. Joke 1, it's comforting to know ancient engineers also wrestled with tangled string and misaligned triangles, just like your last attempt at assembling IKEA furniture. In the corner, a battered leather satchel holds cylindrical tubes, reeds mostly hardened by age. You uncap one and discover remnants of dried pigment clinging to the inner walls, copper green maybe, or crushed lapis. Quirky tidbit, ancient Egyptian cartographers often used soot-based black for borders, red ochre for roads, and blue from azurite to outline rivers. You dip a fingertip inside and emerge with a trace of blue like ghost water from a vanished stream. You wonder if your favorite pen could compete. Spoiler, it cannot. You find a faded parchment nailed to a wooden board, more like a checklist than a map. It's an inventory of supplies: reed pens, charcoal sticks, goat glue, wax thread, star scrolls. Star scrolls, your eyebrows rise. That's not typical map gear. Fringe theories leap in here, claiming star scrolls were night sky maps used to project terrestrial features onto the heavens, a concept mirrored in some Aboriginal Australian cultures. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or practical, but either way it blurs the line between astronomy and geography in ways we still don't fully understand. Your hands settle on a peculiar object, a circular bronze plate, etched with 4 tiny notches around the edge. You recognize it, a dioptra, an early surveying device believed to have been used by the Greeks and later the Romans. But this one bears characters you don't recognize. Not Greek, not Latin, something curvier looping. You spin it lightly in your hands, imagining someone long ago doing the same while squinting into the desert sun to line up a distant cliff. Historians still argue whether these tools were reserved for elite temple architects or used broadly across merchant routes. You'd bet both. After all, sacred geometry and trade profits often walked hand in hand. Resting beside it is what looks like a knotted cord weighted at the end by a stone carved into a perfect cube. It's a plumb line, a tool so ancient it predates writing itself. Builders used it to find the true vertical, but here you suspect it had another role. Some fringe theories suggest these tools helped early astronomer cartographers align earthly features with celestial ones, like shadow-casting temples or pilgrimage paths that tracked the solstice. Joke 2, still more accurate than your cousin's attempt to hang a picture frame using a smartphone-level app. On a nearby bench, rolled hides are bundled with brittle parchment. Unrolling one reveals faded sketches of tools in action figures crouching over wooden rods measuring angles from hilltops. You pause at one, a bearded man with an arm raised to the sun, a curved tool in his hand. A cross staff maybe, long before sextants existed, this stick-and-string contraption helped sailors measure the sun's height above the horizon to determine latitude. Mainstream history pins its use to Arab navigators around the 9th century, but this drawing looks far older. Historians still argue whether the transfer of cartographic tools happened through conquest trade or divine inspiration. What's clear is that many cultures, from Mesopotamians to Polynesians, developed their own technologies for understanding the land and sea. You chuckle at the notion that ancient sailors used knots in a rope to measure speed, a method that gave us the nautical term knots. Joke 3, somewhere out there, a sailor once tripped over a knot and invented physics. You uncover a wooden tray lined with circular molds, some filled with hardened wax, others with charcoal dust. At first they look like candle holders, but closer inspection reveals shallow imprints, mountain symbols, coastline ridges, maybe even wind currents. Could these have been stamps for reproducing map features? If so, that implies early forms of cartographic mass production. Historians still argue whether such molds were used to teach apprentices or standardize trade road charts. Either way, you marvel at the ingenuity. Who needs a printer when you've got a hot wax press and ambition? You sit for a moment, letting the cool air brush across your face. Your eyes close briefly, and you imagine yourself in another time, kneeling at a desert outpost, with a box of tools and a half-finished scroll, trying to align the heavens with the horizon. No computers, no satellites, just chalk lines in the dirt and a head full of stars. You gather the tools back into their resting places, giving each one the quiet respect of an object that once charted the unknown. These weren't just instruments, they were portals, extensions of human will trying to tame the world with string pigment and pressure. As you leave the room, you run a hand along the stone arch. The groove beneath your fingers matches the curve of that old dioptra. It fits, somehow. Somewhere an ancient cartographer smiles in the dark, and you walk away with blue pigment on your hands and a head full of constellations. You step into a domed chamber where the walls curve inward like the inside of a great seashell, and immediately you feel it, the weight of the ocean above you. This room is dedicated entirely to oceanic anomalies and depths. You probably won't survive the pressure of what these maps suggest unless you've got gills, or at least a strong coffee, because tonight you're diving into places no submarine has dared go mapped by hands that may never have seen the sea. The first chart you unroll stretches longer than your arm span. Its surface is dominated not by coastlines or borders, but by massive spirals etched deep into the parchment. At first you think they're waves, but then you realize these are whirlpools, massive ones, bigger than anything you've seen outside of myth. Mainstream accounts mention ancient whirlpools like Charybdis in Homer's Odyssey, a monstrous sea-sucking void capable of swallowing ships whole. But here they're plotted with geometry, measured, mapped, quantified. Historians still argue whether these were real phenomena like maelstroms in Norway or metaphors that somehow crept into navigation charts. You trace a spiral with your finger and spot a triangle beside it. That triangle, unlike the others, contains a tiny skull icon. Fringe theorists love this kind of detail. They say these were not just natural hazards, but intentional markings left by civilizations who understood the sea far better than we give them credit for. Some go further, arguing that deep-sea trenches were viewed as portals to the underworld, to parallel worlds, or even to the origin of life. You smile at the idea that somewhere under the Mariana Trench there's an ancient ticket booth that says "Return trip not guaranteed. Joke one ride at your own risk." A few maps depict not just currents and depths, but anomalies, temperatures, pressures, and even magnetic disturbances. You spot one scroll annotated with lines that spike and curve erratically through the ocean. Modern science recognizes some of these spots as marine magnetic anomalies, places where Earth's field fluctuates dramatically. But this map predates compasses. Historians still argue whether these ancient mariners discovered these spots through observation or intuition, or if the maps were retrofitted later with updated information. You lean closer and spot a small symbol, an eel biting its own tail, drawn over a zone labeled Silent Sea. Creepy, elegant, mysterious. You scan another scroll where the oceans are painted a darker blue, almost black, and labeled with chilling names: the depth of sleep, the hollow gulf tide that never rises. Each of these is drawn with detailed depth lines, some stretching farther down than any contemporary vessel could have measured. Mainstream scholars chalk it up to imagination. Fringe thinkers. They say these charts were created by surface-to-depth signal markers, weighted ropes, tuned sound, or even acoustic observation long before sonar. Historians still argue whether the accuracy of these depths was divine guesswork or disturbingly advanced surveying. A tiny illustration near the equator catches your eye, a ship tipping into a whirlpool while humanoid figures float in the air above arms outstretched. You pause. Are they drowning or flying quirky? Tidbit. Some early cultures believed that the ocean sky mirrored the ocean floor and that death at sea was a form of ascension. You tilt your head. Maybe that's why these figures have halos and what looks like wings, or maybe it's just a terrible interpretation of someone flailing. Either way, it's unsettling. Joke 2 worst cruise itinerary ever. You stumble across a scroll marked only in silver ink, barely legible until your lantern finds the right angle. It's a bathymetric chart, one that details underwater elevations and ridges, but it's wrong, or rather it's impossible. The seafloor rises in perfect cones and right angles. There are underwater pyramids here. Long dismissed as fantasy or poor understanding of geology, these shapes have sparked endless arguments. Historians still debate whether this is pure fiction or exaggerated accounts of things like the Yonaguni Monument in Japan or the so-called Bimini Road in the Bahamas. You can't look away. Part of you wants to dive. Another part says, nope, this is how horror movies start. A scroll near the back shows ocean trenches bleeding off the map's edge into ink-black voids. No annotations, no depths, just black. Fringe lore calls these the edges of memory zones believed to be beyond recording, where maps failed or were forbidden. One map even has a margin note. The scribe's hand stopped here. Historians still argue whether that's poetic drama or genuine fear. You suddenly realize you've been holding your breath. You exhale shaky and step back. It's just ink, just ink. You sit on a low bench carved into the wall beneath a starfish-shaped skylight where the faintest moonlight drips in like milk. You think about sailors thousands of years ago who never saw the bottom of the ocean, never swam deeper than a spear's length, but somehow still understood the pressure, the silence, the cold. They mapped it anyway. Not because they could explore it, but because they imagined it. That's what mapping is, a dream printed on paper. Joke 3, you've imagined the entire ocean with nothing but a stick, some string, and a lot of wishful thinking. And yet here you are, hundreds of feet underground, staring at the same wishful ink. Before you leave, you unroll one final map. It's completely blank, save for a single-centered label in faded gold where the depths sing. You stare. Is that a poetic flourish, a location, a warning? Historians still argue whether such single-line maps were religious icons or puzzle starters intended to activate memory rather than guide travel. You gently roll it back up and return it to its place. You take a deep breath, then let it out, slow and even. The ocean will always remain mysterious, no matter how many maps you draw. But tonight you followed ancient ink through the trenches and whirlpools of forgotten seas, and maybe, just maybe, you've surfaced with more than you expected. You follow a spiral staircase upward, this time winding your way toward the stars. The walls narrow and the air thins. You step into a high-ceilinged observatory chamber where maps are stitched with stars instead of streets. Tonight it's celestial navigation references, and you probably won't survive the existential dread of realizing ancient mapmakers may have known the sky better than you know your own apartment layout. Don't worry though, the stars won't judge you. Probably. The first scroll you open feels more like a tapestry than a map. It's dyed deep indigo, and across its surface constellations are painted in gold leaf. Orion, Ursa, Major, and then ones you've never seen. The sky drawn here is a blend of the familiar and the mythical. Historians still argue whether these unfamiliar star patterns represent lost constellations or regional variations from cultures that never shared their cosmologies with the Western world. You lean in and spot one labeled the winged fish, a creature diving upward instead of swimming down. A metaphor, a legend, or an actual constellation that once guided someone home. Mainstream scholars give credit to the Polynesians for some of the most advanced star-based navigation techniques, especially using star paths to memorize routes between islands. But this map predates Polynesian exploration. The spiral shape of the layout suggests an even older navigational logic, an inner to outer journey, like following the stars from your own heartbeat outward to the cosmos. Fringe researchers propose that such spirals mimic the shape of galaxies, hinting that ancient stargazers understood more than we realize. You smile amused and awed, thinking maybe their data plan went galactic. Joke 1 starlit and slightly smug. One scroll depicts a globe, not of the Earth, but of the night sky. The constellations are arranged in hemispheres with elevation markings along the side. You recognize some of the zodiac signs, but others feel off. Aries appears curled like a nautilus. Leo crouches with wings, and Sagittarius has 3 arms. Are these alternate interpretations, religious iconography, or someone just had a creative streak? Historians still argue whether constellation art was based on oral storytelling or used to encode navigation techniques hidden in myth. You notice tiny dots between the stars' notations in even rows. Numbers, possibly degrees. One line reads, Rise 12, set 239. Could these be azimuthal measurements? If so, whoever drew this wasn't guessing. They were calculating. That would mean this map acted as a star compass, one that lets sailors determine direction based purely on the position of a star relative to the horizon. You squint upward. Even if you memorized 24 constellations, you'd still get lost trying to find your car in a mall parking lot. Joke 2 celestial maps great for oceans, useless at IKEA. Another scroll surprises you. It looks like a traditional sea map until you realize the islands are star-shaped and the oceans are labeled Void Drift and Glass Sea. You've stumbled into a sky map designed like a sea map. Perhaps it was meant to train navigators to use stellar positions as waypoints in literal water-based journeys. Historians still argue whether this was metaphorical or whether they believe the sky and ocean mirrored each other in ways both spiritual and practical. Quirky tidbit: some ancient cultures believe the Milky Way was a celestial river crossable only in death or through dreams. This map takes that literally, with a dotted line crossing the galactic river and a small boat icon beside it. A second scroll shows that same river, but with a warning scrawled at its base: cross not before the third moon. You don't know whether that's a calendar reference or just really cryptic parking advice. You pause before a wall chart much taller than you. It's not paper, it's cloth rough and faded, likely flax or linen. The stars are sewn in with metallic thread, and here the celestial compass points are labeled not as north, south, east or west, but hunger, breath, fire and silence. Historians still argue whether this symbolic labeling reflects climate patterns, ritual directions or metaphysical forces. You love the idea of pointing someone west and telling them to head straight into silence. Feels poetic. Feels final. One fragment features a peculiar circular overlay like a wheel turned sideways, divided into 12 wedges. This isn't astrology, not in the pop culture sense. It's a kind of calendar map, likely lunar, with constellation positions noted for each wedge. Ancient Mesopotamians used star charts not just to navigate but to plan harvests, coronations, and even military campaigns. You run your fingers over the soft etching and imagine a general refusing to march because Orion wasn't high enough in the sky. You take a moment to sit on a stone bench and stare up. The chamber's dome has a circular cutout directly overhead, an oculus. Through it the night sky peaks in stars flickering with all their ancient patience. You picture someone sitting right here 1,000 years ago, holding one of these scrolls, aligning it with the stars, feeling both powerful and impossibly small. You understand them. Joke 3, no matter how far we've come, we still get lost. Staring into the night and whispering, "Wait, is that the Big Dipper? Or just airplane lights?" You rise and gently roll the scrolls back into their tubes. On one last parchment, near the bottom, a line reads, "When the stars are wrong, no ship shall find land." You pause. Historians still argue whether this is apocalyptic poetry or practical wisdom for navigators during storm seasons. Either way, the message is clear. Maps aren't just about places, they're about timing. You close the chamber door behind you, stars lingering in your mind like distant echoes. Tonight you've wandered across skies no longer seen and listened to whispers left behind in constellations. You may not know every star's name, but you now understand how they once pointed the way, not just across oceans, but into the very soul of exploration. You descend a narrow staircase, lit only by flickering sconces, the stone beneath your feet, worn smooth by centuries of quiet steps. You enter a vaulted room that feels different, warm, a stranger, like it is holding its breath. And then you see the monsters, all over the walls and maps, creatures coiled, clawed, winged, and utterly improbable. Tonight you're surrounded by mythical creatures, warnings, and you probably won't survive this one if you're afraid of sea serpents with great dental hygiene. The first map you unfold is a seafaring chart wave, patterns inked in swirls, coastal edges scalloped with care, but your eyes go straight to the beast. It slithers across the center in brilliant reds and greens, with a fish's tail, the face of a lion, and wings like a dragonfly. In neat ink beside it, the warning reads, "Here dwell beasts that hunger for stars." Yikes! You pull back slightly, half expecting it to wiggle. Joke 1. This is why you don't go skinny dipping in legendary waters. Mainstream historians often write off such beasts as artistic space fillers, born from ignorance or overactive imaginations. But these creatures weren't scattered randomly. They consistently appear at the same coordinates, on different maps from different centuries. Serpents around Iceland, kraken shapes off Norway, feathered leviathans off the coast of Sumatra. Historians still argue whether these were shared hallucinations, storytelling traditions, or garbled memories of real sea animals like oarfish, giant squid, or baleen whales breaching at the wrong moment. You move to another scroll and trace a long, tapering shape, etched with interlocking spirals and dozens of eyes. The note beside it says, "To pass beneath the gaze is death." Some fringe theorists suggest this refers to ancient underwater caves lined with reflective crystal places, where natural phosphorescence created glowing eyes. Others believe it's metaphorical, cautioning sailors to avoid certain routes, not because of beasts, but because of rival clans or hidden rocks. You raise an eyebrow. Historians still argue whether sailors crafted beasts to guard secrets they didn't want others to discover. Quirky tidbit: medieval monks believed that unicorns were real and not shy woodland creatures, but maritime beasts drawn to virgin sacrifices left on rocky shores. One map here shows such a ritual drawn in uncomfortable detail. The unicorn looks more like a narwhal on steroids. You chuckle softly, wondering how many poor sailors mistook a porpoise for prophecy. Joke 2. When cryptozoology meets creative licensing. In one corner of a torn map is a doodle of a turtle so massive that it's mistaken for an island. In fact, the caption reads, "Do not build fires on the shell. This is no joke." In ancient lore, especially from the Indian Ocean, there are tales of ships dropping anchor on a seemingly solid island, only for it to dive beneath the waves. Today we recognize the myth of the Aspidocolone part turtle part legend. Historians still argue whether this was born of confusing whale sightings or was simply a warning to always test the ground beneath your feet. Sound advice, map or not. You open a scroll painted in dark blue and gold, the sea dotted with dozens of jagged teeth, each labeled with a different beast. The skybiter, the blood current, the one-eyed bride. Okay, that one's just haunting. The symbols beside each name vary. Some look like fangs, others like moons or tridents. Fringe thinkers believe these weren't creatures at all, but nicknames for natural phenomena, whirlpools, rogue waves, or magnetic anomalies. Historians still argue whether fear created these legends or if sailors encountered something they couldn't explain. Another map shows an inland lake in the middle of a desert, with a massive coiled creature floating at its center. Its body is segmented like armor, and the annotation reads, "It sleeps by fire, wakes by drought." Some speculate this represents a dormant volcano. Others suggest desert mirages were once believed to be breathing monsters. You shake your head grateful your water bottle doesn't require interpretation. And then there's the griffin. Not just one, but dozens drawn flying across the edges of 3 different scrolls. Wings outstretched, talons poised. Each time they hover just beyond mountains labeled unpassable. Perhaps they were guardians, perhaps metaphors for failure. Historians still argue whether such recurring guardians reflect fears of divine retribution or simply bad weather ahead. You whisper to yourself, "Should have packed a griffin-repellent poncho." Joke 3 bedtime monster protection available in aisle 7. One of the most peculiar maps is carved, not drawn, etched into a sheet of polished slate. It's rough like a seafarer's keepsake. A serpent wraps around the border, but its head is missing. instead scratched near the edge, a message. The head follows the heart. You stare at that for a while. Could this be a cipher, a riddle, or just poetic nonsense muttered by a sailor on his third cup of fermented shark milk? Either way, you're hooked. You begin to notice a trend. These monsters aren't at the center of maps. They guard the edges, always. As if to say, beyond this point your rules do not apply. Historians still argue whether this convention began as a spiritual boundary or a practical one, a way to indicate the limits of known terrain. The monsters then were stand-ins for uncertainty, for chaos, for don't go here unless you really mean it. You sit beside a scroll nearly 6 feet long, watching the candlelight flicker across the inked scales of a dragon the size of an island. The note beside its snout. He waits for songs, not swords. You can't help but grin. Somewhere someone imagined that a dragon could be calmed, not by conquest, but by lullaby. Maybe that's why we're here tonight, unrolling maps in the quiet whispering to the past. You gently re-roll the final scroll, the beasts now safely tucked away. Not slain, not dismissed, just sleeping again. As you leave the chamber, you whisper to yourself, here be monsters, not as a warning, but as an invitation. You make your way into a dim chamber, lit only by slanting light through a single high window, where broken compasses and torn scrolls lie abandoned like forgotten arguments. Tonight you enter the realm of geographical misplacement debates, and you probably won't survive this if you hate being wrong, because every map in here disagrees with reality. Or maybe reality just hasn't caught up yet. You spread a scroll across a cracked marble slab, and immediately you see it, a massive mountain range, drawn where nothing mountainous exists. Right in the heart of the Sahara, towering peaks labeled Montes Lux. Mainstream historians chalk such inaccuracies up to hearsay, merchants, pilgrims or soldiers describing dunes as cliffs. But some of these maps show topographic detail, valleys, snowcaps, tributaries, as if someone had been there, really been there. Historians still argue whether these misplaced ranges were the result of traveler exaggeration, or if they reflect ancient climate patterns back when the Sahara was green. You glance at the dates and notes. One says 1231, another 1086, another just says day 12 of the Firewind. Not super helpful. But then you find 3 separate maps drawn centuries apart, all showing the same mountain, its peak labeled Astramea, sitting in completely different continents. Europe, Asia, Africa. Fringe theorists love this one. They say Astramea was a real mountain that moved in myth like some kind of teleporting peak. Mainstream scholars more sensibly suggest it was just a name applied to many mountains over time. But still, weird. You raise an eyebrow. Either the ancient folks were deeply confused, or the mountain had frequent flyer miles. Joke 1 geological relocation service now available in fantasy only. You scan another scroll. It shows a river clearly labeled as the Nile flowing west. Not south to north, but directly west into what looks like the Atlantic. You pause. Could it be an entirely different river, misnamed, or a lost tributary? Fringe researchers insist this is evidence of a prehistoric Nile route, now buried beneath the Sahara's shifting sands. Satellite imaging has revealed ancient dry channels across North Africa, so maybe the maps weren't wrong, they were just early. Historians still argue whether such errors are innocent confusions or echoes of real lost knowledge. One scroll dares even more. It places the Great Wall of China. Yes, that Great Wall on the far side of the Caspian Sea, wrapped like a ribbon across mountain ridges in what is now Azerbaijan. You chuckle. Joke 2 when ancient cartographers went copy-paste before it was cool. Some say this was an attempt to depict different walls used by steppe empires. Others think it was a case of mistranslation, but historians still argue whether ancient traders were describing different fortifications entirely, or if these maps reflect garbled tales of distant travels across linguistic gaps. Quirky tidbit: one Renaissance-era mapmaker confidently drew the Pacific Ocean as a narrow river with a lush farmland in the middle. He labeled it Mar de los Dioses, Sea of the Gods, and even drew tiny cows grazing on its banks. Modern researchers believe he mistook a distorted traveler's account of Peru's inland valleys for an ocean and then tried to fill the rest in with guesswork. You grin. Cows in the sea. That's a bedtime image that'll swim through your dreams. Joke 3 bovine and blessed. You find an atlas bound in cracked leather. Each page shows a different world. No, really. Continents twisted into bizarre shapes. Australia up near Siberia. Africa split in two. Iceland stretching like a spaghetti noodle across the Atlantic. You check the front matter, no date. Just a line. In the days before the turning, cryptic, fringe believers argue these maps preserve pre-cataclysmic knowledge, some even tie it to Atlantis. Mainstream historians say it's just bad measuring. You tilt your head. Or maybe both. Maybe someone did see the world before it changed, and we've been correcting their mistakes ever since. You pause at a coastal map where two bays overlap. Literally. Same region, two different shorelines drawn in the same space. One is rocky, one is soft and sandy, both labeled Bay of Echoes. Is this a metaphor, a mapping glitch, or did the shoreline itself change? Historians still argue whether such overlaid maps suggest shifting coasts from erosion and earthquakes, or were simply artistic flourishes meant to show possibilities. You prefer the mystery. Maps that contain two truths at once feel more honest somehow. Next, you find a map that insists the Amazon River has its source in Tibet. You cough. Bold move. But the strange thing, the route it follows overlaps with mountain streams that do exist thousands of miles away. Fringe theorists suggest ancient mariners conflated two river systems based on trade paths and created an imaginary mega-river connecting east to west. Historians still argue whether this was delusion, political ambition, or hope dressed up in ink. You whisper, "Nice try and fold it back," like you're closing a fantasy novel. One of the most mysterious scrolls is entirely unlabeled, just a map with perfectly straight borders and triangle-shaped islands equidistant from each other, like chess pieces. It's too precise, too intentional. It doesn't resemble Earth at all. Some believe it's a training tool or perhaps a religious map of a sacred order's imaginary world. Others say it's a code and overlay for another map entirely. You study it for a long moment, sensing that whatever it depicts, it's not about geography, it's about control. Historians still argue whether these gridded worlds were artistic abstractions or early attempts at visualizing philosophical balance. You return to the first scroll, the mountain in the wrong place, and run your finger along its peak. You realize something strange. It's drawn using red ink, not the brown or black of the rest of the map. Highlighted. On purpose. You flip to another scroll. Same mountain, same red peak. Always alone, always apart. Maybe the mountain didn't move. Maybe it never existed. Maybe it was a symbol, or a promise, or a memory that wouldn't die. You roll the scrolls up slowly, carefully, as if afraid you'll crumple the debate. Because maybe that's the point. These maps don't ask you to believe. They ask you to wonder. And tonight, in this quiet room of errors, you're beginning to think the wrong places might have been the right ones all along. You find yourself in a room unlike any other, a curated sanctuary with velvet-lined drawers and air so still it feels preserved. Here lies the rediscovered Eldoria map the cartographic unicorn whispered about in obscure circles and dismissed in most reputable ones. You probably won't survive the jaw-drop moment ahead if you're the type who corrects fantasy maps in novels. But tonight you're staring at something real. Maybe. You ease the drawer open. Inside, cushioned by black velvet, is a scroll of unusual material. Not papyrus, not parchment, but something between cured leather and pressed leaf. The surface shimmers faintly like it remembers the hand that painted it. Etched into it is a landmass that doesn't appear on any modern map. It's not misplaced. It's not distorted. It's entirely unknown. One word marks the center in faded gold: Eldoria. Mainstream historians believe the Eldoria map is a forgery. Too convenient, too pretty, too complete. But here it is. Not in a dusty footnote, not in a forgotten exhibit, but in your hands. You study its features: mountain ranges traced in cobalt blue forests, etched in minute brush strokes, rivers winding like veins across a pale green plain. At the northern edge, in calligraphy too delicate for ink quills, is written, "The city that listens to rain." Historians still argue whether Eldoria was a myth, a metaphor, or a misplaced colony mislabeled in some sailor's logbook. But this map suggests something more deliberate, an organized, intelligent civilization plotted with care and style. Fringe theorists claim Eldoria was the capital of a lost empire whose memory was erased by political or natural disaster. Others say it was a sanctuary, one deliberately kept off the grid. You whisper hide and seek, her joke won, because nothing hides like a city with no address. You lean closer and find tiny constellation markers along the coastline. Not random, they matched those seen from the southern hemisphere. That puts Eldoria somewhere below the equator. But here's the twist: the star alignments suggest a sky not seen in our current epoch. Some astronomers argue that the star positions here match a view from 12,000 years ago. Historians still argue whether that's coincidence, calculation, or cosmic prank. You swallow. If this is accurate, Eldoria wasn't just lost in space. It was lost in time. Quirky tidbit: one field scholar who examined a photo of the Eldoria map in the 1970s reported falling into a trance, during which she claimed to hear the map, rainfall whispers, and chimes like wind through glass. She published her notes in a now-banned newsletter called the Fifth Meridian Quarterly. You grin trying to imagine a bureaucrat banning a newsletter. Joke 2, imagine redacting rainfall. In the southeast corner of the map, drawn in delicate ink, is a building shaped like a spiral shell. Not a temple, not a fortress. The caption reads, "House of Voices." You can't stop staring at it. Inside the shell, concentric lines coil inward like an ear. Some believe this was Eldoria's great archive, not for books but for sound oral histories, etched onto obsidian discs or sung into hollow trees. Historians still argue whether these are allegories or physical technologies we've simply lost. You move to the western side, where a small archipelago fans outward like petals. Each island is labeled not with a name but with a question. What did you leave behind? Where does the river end? Who will carry your story? You feel a chill. Are these places or choices, directions, portals? You remember Section 12's monster maps and the riddle that read, "Come with sail, leave with silence." Eldoria may have been the answer to that riddle, or the origin of it. The map is symmetrical in some places, but not perfectly. Some river deltas mirror each other. Some cities reflect sky symbols. You realize with a start it's a mandala, not just a chart of land, but a symbolic map of a civilization's beliefs. Fringe thinkers say Eldoria's maps were never for navigation, they were tools for inner journeying, a blueprint for the soul. Mainstream scholars, as always, roll their eyes. Historians still argue whether this style of mapping began with sacred geometry or was retrofitted to justify aesthetic whimsy. Your lamp flickers. The gold ink on Eldoria's borders catches the light glinting like a solar flare. Along the bottom edge is a small square, inset a map within the map. A familiar coastline appears, too familiar. It's yours, your continent, your hemisphere, but it's labeled the Echo Rim. You exhale. You're not outside the Eldoria map. You're part of it. Joke 3. You've been living on the edge of Meath all along. You take one last look. At the center of Eldoria's landmass, surrounded by 3 rivers and a ring of trees, is a small circle labeled simply Remember. You close your eyes. You're not sure if it's a name, a command, or a prophecy. All you know is it matters. You re-roll the map slowly, reverently, and place it back in its drawer. The velvet sighs beneath it, like the earth exhaling after a secret is returned. As you leave the chamber, you feel something change, not around you, but in you. Eldoria may not be found on any satellite image, but tonight you stood inside its borders. You followed its rivers. You heard its silence. And somewhere beneath the constellations and oceans and time, it remembers you too. You walk down a narrow hall, the last one for tonight, where the ceiling lowers and the walls close in like the ribs of a sleeping creature. The air is warmer here, more humid, almost as if it remembers breath. This room, quieter than the rest, is filled with soft drawers, unlabeled chests, and bundles of parchment tied together with faded ribbon. This is where the story ends, or more precisely where it circles back. Tonight you'll be tracing the lost civilization behind the maps. And you probably won't survive the ache of realizing they may have known more about us than we do about them. You open a flat chest and lift a folder. Inside is not a map, but a set of notes. Careful sketches of symbols found across all the maps you've seen tonight. The spiral, the feather, the eye, the circle within a circle. In one corner of the page, a single word, Themara. Not a place, a people. A name whispered through margins and borders, coastlines and stars. Historians still argue whether Themara was a tribe, an empire, or a myth of the mapmakers themselves. Cartography turned culture. You flip to a second sheet. It's a rough genealogy, not of kings or bloodlines, but of glyphs. It traces the evolution of border symbols, creature warnings, and celestial alignments across centuries. Someone, long before you, saw the pattern. The spiral wasn't just decoration, it marked migration routes. The feather symbol denoted peace or pilgrimage. The eye, watchfulness, presence, guardianship. Quirky Tidbit 1 anthropologist argued that the eye glyph only ever appears on maps of places that later became pilgrimage sites, as if the map was the prophecy. She was laughed out of the conference. You'd buy her a coffee. You turn another page and find a city diagram. Not Eldoria, something else. A series of nested circles, roads radiating outward like veins from a beating heart. At its center a tower, labeled the Breath Post. Historians still argue whether this was a real tower, a metaphor for enlightenment, or the world's earliest library. But one fringe theory claims it was a signal tower where the Themara transmitted knowledge across the continent using light, sound, or vibrations. Joke 1 ancient Wi-Fi, no password required. You discover fragments of writing translated or attempted to be. One phrase repeats, "We map the world to remember the soul." You pause, goosebumps rising. Not to control, not to own, to remember. Suddenly, every misaligned coastline and misplaced mountain feels less like an error and more like a message. These people didn't see maps as static. They saw them as memory scaffolds. Historians still argue whether such emotional cartography was widespread or unique to Themara's culture. A folded diagram tucked between pages shows the entire globe. Land, sea, sky, even the underworld. Yes, a layer below rendered in brown ink, marked with symbols of doorways, bones, and what appear to be roots. Some fringe circles refer to this as the root layer theory, that ancient civilizations believed in vertical maps, not just horizontal ones. The sky above the world in the middle and the ancestors below. You smile. 3 worlds all drawn in ink. 3 lives all walked in parallel. Joke 2 GPS would have a meltdown trying to triangulate that. You find a small stitched book, half notebook, half prayer journal. On its last page, a passage written in a shaky aged script. If we are ever forgotten, we leave this behind. So you may know we lived, we dreamed, we charted what mattered, and if you read this, then we are not gone. You sit quietly for a long while. Eventually you stand and gather the scattered clues, the star symbols, the spirals, the monsters that marked fear, the rivers that meant more than water. You realize the maps weren't just tools, they were testaments. These people mapped not what they saw, but what they believed, what they remembered, what they hoped to return to. The Mara was never lost, it was left behind, intentionally, as if waiting for someone, maybe not you, but someone like you, to open the right drawer and begin to listen. You close the chest not with finality, but with care. You walk back through the archive, past the sleeping scrolls, the beasts, the star maps, the whirlpools, and the vanished coasts. You breathe in deeply, letting the scent of old ink and memory wrap around you one last time. Then slowly you step into the corridor's dim light and close the door behind you.